Weeding is often a really important task in any vegetable garden or growing space. And depending on the method that we use and the context that we're growing in, it can be one of the most time-consuming tasks in the gardens. And the success and abundance of our gardens often depends on how successful we are at managing the weeds. After many years of practice and learning from a lot of mistakes, I've generally become fairly good at keeping all of the growing spaces that we manage as part of this Red Gardens project free of both our annual and perennial weeds. But last year, in one of the larger polytunnels, I broke one of the most important rules of weed management. And this spring, I've been dealing with the consequences of that lack of action, and will probably have an increased workload for managing weeds in this polytunnel for quite a few years. Most of the issues that I've had with weeds in the gardens relate to perennial weeds, especially those weeds that have a rhizome network of root systems, including scotchgrass or couchgrass, bindweed, and creeping thistle. There are a few other perennial weeds that can also be a problem, including creeping buttercup and nettles, and a few others that I've not fully identified yet. But they can generally be easier to remove because most of the growth is at or just below the surface of the soil. And I've become fairly good at removing most of the taproot of the ubiquitous dandelion and dockweeds. But the deeper spreading root systems of bindweed, scotchgrass, and creeping thistle can be much more difficult, as the plants can regrow from even the smallest fragment of root left behind. In the established growing spaces, I generally find it easier to dig out the roots of these weeds that do come in, even in the spaces that I try to manage with no-dig methods. And I generally try to surround all of the growing spaces with a buried sheet of plastic to prevent the weed roots from growing back in, or at least slow them down. And when I try to establish a new growing space in soil that has any of these weeds, I've generally found it best to cover the entire area with a double layer of ground cover fabric for at least a full year in order to kill off all the vegetation before starting the garden. I've tried other methods, but nothing else seems to really work as well, and even with the double layer of ground cover fabric for a year, there's still some surviving weeds that need to be dug out. I have found that annual weeds can be a lot easier to deal with. These are plants that grow from a seed each year and can usually be killed off with a few passes of a weeder or a hoe, or can simply be pulled out by hand. Annual weeds are usually more of an issue in the first few years after establishing a growing space, as there is often a big bank of dormant weed seeds lying in the soil waiting to germinate. With a deep enough layer of mulch, a lot of these weed seeds can be encouraged to remain in their dormant state, perhaps indefinitely. But in the growing spaces where I cultivate the soil regularly, a new crop of weed seeds come up to the surface to germinate every year. But eventually, after a few years, the number of weed seeds that are available in the soil to sprout starts to drop off quite a bit. But I'm still dealing with the weed seeds that might blow in from the surrounding landscape. And sometimes I have to deal with a lot of weed seedlings that I brought in compost that didn't get hot enough to kill off all the seeds. So there is usually weeding to be done in all of the growing spaces, and I try to keep them as weed-free as possible by trying to weed all of the different areas at least once a week during the growing season, though this isn't always possible when things get really busy. Annual weed seedlings like this are generally really easy to kill off when they're very young, so really frequent weeding can actually take less time than waiting a few more weeks and having to deal with a lot more established weeds. And it's also better for the crops that I want to grow. Depending on the time of year and how busy I've been, the gardens can be relatively free of weeds, with only a few weeds spotted here and there. And it's even been suggested by some people that I must be using weed killer in order to be able to keep the gardens so weed free. But it really comes down to persistence. And it's really important to never let a weed plant go to seed in any of the growing spaces, or even any of the vegetable plants. Letting any plant go to seed in the garden simply means that there's probably going to be a lot more weeding to be done for quite a few years. Never letting a weed go to seed is the most important rule of weed management that I broke in this polytunnel last year. I didn't break it intentionally, but it's not surprising that I broke it given the way that I tend to manage things when I've got too much on. I have this tendency to abandon things, especially when a crop or an experiment isn't doing so well. This might prompt some people to pay more attention to it, but it seems that I have a habit of simply looking the other way and letting things fail. I usually take on way too much, but then when I become busy or stressed or frustrated, I seem to take the opportunity of simply letting something go. This is probably healthy in some ways as it reduces stress and workload, but it can lead to problems later on. In this case, I was trying to grow bush or determinate varieties of tomatoes in a central section of one of the beds in the polytunnel. I usually grow indeterminate or tall varieties of tomatoes that I heavily prune and hang the long vines from the polytunnel structure, so I don't have a lot of experience with bush or indeterminate varieties, but I thought I'd try growing them over a low frame to keep the plants off of the soil. This worked up to a certain point, and then the plants became a big tangled mess of vines. And there were also some other health issues with the plants, and I suspect verticillium wilt, which I had found in some of the other plants in the same polytunnel. As the summer got increasingly busy, I ended up leaving these plants mostly alone, more or less abandoning them, though I did continue to harvest some of the tomatoes. And it was quite late in the season before I ended up clearing the remains of this crop, including the weeds that were happily growing underneath the tomato plants. Not clearing or caring for the tomato plants was one issue, but not clearing or removing the weeds earlier in the season ended up being a much bigger problem. And there were probably several generations of weeds that had sprouted and grown, flowered, produced seeds, dropped those seeds, which then sprouted again to grow again to produce another crop, which substantially increased the amount of seeds that were actually left in the soil. I knew that this was going to be an issue this growing season, but I was hoping that it wasn't going to be so bad. But in early spring of this year, it was obvious that I'd made quite a big mistake when a carpet of green weed seedlings appeared in one large section of this polytunnel. At that point, I had several options on how to proceed. I could cultivate and hoe this section of the soil quite regularly to kill all the weeds and delay planting any crop until the bed was completely clear. But with the cool temperatures of the spring and the general moist conditions, a lot of these weed seedlings would have been simply transplanted to a new location rather than being killed off quite quickly. These cool conditions would also rule out any type of solarization, with placing a clear sheet of plastic on the surface of the soil where the excess heat is supposed to kill off the weed seedlings. This solarization process doesn't really work very well at all in the cool and cloudy climate that we have here in Ireland, especially in the cold spring. I could have covered the entire section with a black plastic or a ground cover fabric to exclude the light and not planted in this area until I was sure that most of the weed seedlings had sprouted and died off because of a lack of light. But any delay would have meant that I wouldn't be able to get a fast-growing spring crop out of this section of the bed before the main crop of the summer. I ended up using a flame weeder to torch the carpet of small weed seedlings. The heat of the flame was enough to wilt and eventually kill off the young seedling, but not enough to really heat up the soil. And I repeated this flaming a few times over the week to make sure that I killed off any seedlings that might have been missed in the first few passes, and I was hoping that this was enough. And once the bed was mostly cleared, I transplanted some larger growing plants into the bed, thinking that the wider spacing between the plants would make any necessary weeding in the future a bit easier. But I didn't expect so many more weed seeds to germinate and grow over the following few weeks as the soil continued to warm up. I ended up with lots of additional weeding to do, especially after I was away from the gardens for more than a week, something that growers should avoid doing in the spring. It wasn't such a big issue, but it did take some extra time to clear the weeds from this bed, which involved some hand weeding and some wire weeding, and making sure that I removed all the remains of the plants so that they didn't regrow in the bed. And I'll probably have to weed again in the next week or two to make sure that all the weeds are removed from this section of the garden. And overall, I'm not sure this extra work was worth the effort compared to the value of the crop that I'm going to get. If I had covered the area with a black plastic, or if I'd left it open and empty so that I could continue to flame weed or hoe several times over the season, this would have saved a fair amount of time, and I do have a lot of other space to grow in. But I also have the tendency to want to grow everywhere, especially with the enthusiasm of the spring. Unfortunately, even after this crop and all the weeding that I've already done, there will still be some weeding issues in this section of the polytunnel. Seeds of many types of weeds apparently have a delay mechanism, which allows them to germinate at different times over many years, which is probably the origin of the saying that 1 year seeding leads to 7 years weeding. It seems that we have bred this delay mechanism out of most of the crops that we grow. So leaving a vegetable plant in the garden to develop seeds and let those seeds drop in the soil will likely lead to a huge number of seedlings the following year, but not a lot in the few years after that. But the delayed sprouting of some of the seeds is a really good survival mechanism for so many of the weeds that we find in our gardens. So I suspect I'll have to put in additional effort to weed this section of the polytunnel for quite a few years, which is a shame because we had just got this space largely weed-free. And it might be worth the extra cost and effort to add an additional fairly thick layer of weed-free compost to the beds of this polytunnel to bury the remaining seeds even deeper, hoping that they will never sprout. Abandoning a crop or not looking after it, or at least not making sure that all the weeds were cleared from underneath this mess of tomato vines, has led to additional work and potentially more cost. Even a few minutes of work at several times last summer to remove any weeds that were there could have saved a lot of work this spring and for several years in the future. I knew this, of course, but failed to do what was needed to be done at the time. And I blame the fact that I usually take on too much, paired with my tendency to abandon things when they're not going so well. I should work on both of those habits so that I don't keep making more work for myself in the future. I don't really like making videos like this. I'd much rather make videos about all these trials and experiments and successes that I have in the gardens. But I think it's important to share our failures as well. I hope that if I describe my own failures and detail why I think they would happen, it will help other people to learn from my mistakes rather than having to make them themselves. And perhaps help people understand how their own habits and personalities can have a significant impact on their own growing spaces. If you like this type of video and the other videos that I make on this channel and find value in the explorations that I do, please consider supporting this Red Gardens project either through Patreon or PayPal. The links to both are in the video description. But most importantly, thank you for watching.